I think you're in for a real treat this hour. My main problem is going to be, like James just was, keeping to the hour, because I think I could probably spend the whole afternoon talking to any one of these guys. Some of you I have done.
Yes.
So I'm going to introduce everyone very briefly and then introduce them in more depth in a minute. So first, on your right, we have Alex Pheby, the author of Playthings, and he is here with his editor from Gallibeggar Press, Sam Jordison. Then we have Sunny Singh, the author of Hotel Arcadia, and actually you two are in the wrong order the way I'm describing this. Rohan Quine, the author of Beasts of the Electra Drive, and his editor, Dan Holloway. I think I should start by explaining the strange title that we've given this panel. The 4 sessions that you've been listening to up until now have all been focused on different genres, romance, science fiction, and so on. And in simplistic terms, you could fit each of the books that we're talking about this afternoon into those categories. Playthings is a historical novel set in early 20th century Germany. Hotel Arcadia is a thriller about a terrorist attack. And Beasts of Electra Drive is a fantasy about video game characters that cross over into meat space. But each of them is also something much more complex and subtle than that, and each of them defies the simple expectations of those genres. So what we wanted to explore when we first started talking about doing this panel was how the editing process works when you're confronted with a manuscript like that. How do you home in on what's unique about it, and how do you ensure that you don't destroy that unique thing in the process of polishing the manuscript? How, in fact, do you preserve the unicorn? So I'm going to start with you, Sunny. Now, Sunny Singh is an author and journalist and also teaches creative writing at London Metropolitan University. She was born in India and has lived in Pakistan, Spain, South Africa, Latin America, and the US, and now lives in London. And she's also something of a phenomenon on Twitter, which is where we first met. If you're interested in geopolitics, follow Sunny on Twitter. You will find out more things about politics around the world and more shades of understanding than you can anywhere else. She's like a one-woman list. So Hotel Arcadia, as I said, is a novel about a terrorist attack. It has an opening chapter that's headed 87 hours ago, which is clearly pointing at something that is terrible that's going to happen. So on the face of it, it could be an outline of a Die Hard film. But Sunny transforms it into something quite different. It's also a duet or a love story between 2 people who never actually meet. And this is the bit that got me hooked. It was written in part in response to Sunny's reading of Dante's Inferno. So would you like to tell us a bit more about that, Sunny?
Of course. About Dante's Inferno or just...
Well, yeah.
I'll try and stay brief with it so that everyone else gets a chance to talk. But I discovered Dante when I was at university at a class I took in my junior year. I went to university in the US, so I still talk about it, so that would be 3rd year out of a 4-year degree. And I absolutely fell in love with the book, the entire Divine Comedy, but specifically Inferno. So, and every time I get stuck or I have a writer's block, I tend to go back and start reading it. Generally in the first 70 pages, an idea pops up, and then I can sort of put it aside and go back, work on the idea. And when I feel like I'm running short of inspiration and juice, I kind of dip back into and talk to the old man himself. And it's become over the years a kind of an ongoing conversation that happens in my imagination between me and Dante, the writer, through his pages. Interestingly enough, the professor I took that class with, and I still stay in touch, so we email each other, and he will give me ideas, and we'll have these very complicated, fairly obscure discussions about lines. But I think for me, that's one of the areas where I find inspiration, I find comfort, And writing can be quite a solitary enterprise, so I find a kind of a dialogue. So I think that's where the Dante link comes in. Now, with Hotel Arcadia, the starting point of it is the second circle of hell, which is for adulterers. And there is a couple in there, Francesca and Paolo, who were killed by Francesca's husband, Paolo's brother, for being involved with each other for adultery, and they've been punished to circle each other, see each other, desire each other for all eternity in the second circle of hell. But they can never consummate their love. Now, even as a 19-year-old, when I was at university, I remember looking at it going, this is not a bad thing. I know I'm supposed to feel bad for them, and I know this is damnation and it's terrible. But in addition to this no consummation, there is also the other side, where there is absolute certainty that you can love and be loved by that person forever. And I've always found that a really quite an interesting idea. This also, of course, it helps that I went to Catholic schools and I studied Catholic theology, but I'm not a Catholic myself, so I bring a very Indic sensibility to it. Again, we had huge arguments in class with my professor, and we continued to argue this point over and over with him going, this is not a good thing, this is damnation. Doesn't quite work. So when I started looking at Hotel Arcadia, I had this idea of these two people who would somehow develop this intimacy, and they didn't need to see each other. They wouldn't need to meet. They wouldn't need to consummate this love in this, or this intimacy in a stereotypical or even a kind of lived way, because it would be so powerful. So that was my idea of writing this particular novel. The rest of it, the idea of being in a hotel under siege, all of that came afterwards. The seed was that love story, and the idea that would be quite, especially in our times where intimacy is often fleeting and unreliable. I think I wanted that idea of this great love story, and that's really where it started. So it's quite strange because it's often described as a thriller. I still think that Hotel Arcadia is actually a love story.
Now, you're very careful in Hotel Arcadia not to identify the city by the sea where this happens, which reminds you that this is something that could happen anywhere. But there was an inciting incident in your mind as well, wasn't there?
Yes. When I used to work in Latin America in the 90s, and I did lots of different things in various spots. And there was one hotel in Lima that quite a lot of us used to stay in while we were traveling through. Now, this is, of course, the time of the Shining Path. We were so focused on ISIS and post 9/11 global war on terror that we've forgotten that we probably live in times that have less and fewer terrorist incidences than any other time before. So even in Europe, 70s and 80s saw more terrorist attacks than now, and yet we have this narrative that it's somehow something we're living in, not ever before. But so when in the 90s, Shining Path, early 90s, Shining Path was still quite active. They were involved with bombings and other, let's say, acts of non-state violence. I know that sounds really strange, but we forget that as citizens and people living in a society, what we start with is handing over the state a monopoly on violence. We say, okay, fine, police can carry guns, police can execute people, police can put people in jail. Everyone else who does it is somehow bad. And of course, that's where the issue with actors such as Shining Path or IRA and ITA and all these people come in, because they break that monopoly. So Shining Path was very active, and at one point they bombed the hotel reception that we used to constantly stay at. We knew the people who worked there. They weren't people you were friends with, but the receptionist, the bellboy, the people, you would just constantly have a chat with, then because you would be in and out, and I just remember the anger that I felt, because somehow in attacking this hotel, which was a symbol of whatever they were fighting against, that actually the two people who were killed were the poorest and the most hardworking at the bottom of the pile. So technically, they were the people they were Shining Path were fighting for, and yet those were the first people killed. And I think that stayed with me, and that was something I wanted to explore with the terrorist attack.
Now, we wanted to talk about editing. And I know that your Dutch translator played a very interesting role in editing Hotel Arcadia. It shows up something about the nature of storytelling traditions and the way that different languages express certain things, and how that can filter back through the translation process. So can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I'm sure we all are very aware that editing has changed very quickly in the last decade, but in the last few decades. I remember as an aspiring writer, as a teenager, finding the processes and the entire discussion around Raymond Chandler's editor and the role that was played in transforming these quite messy manuscripts into what we now consider sparse, powerful prose. And of course, as a writer, I had this grand fantasy that somewhere there will be this editor who will work with me over the course of my career, and somehow we will have this perfect partnership. Of course, by the time I started producing and publishing, that wasn't going to happen. The industry had changed. With Hotel Arcadia, so in the last two novels I came up with, I worked with editors in different ways. Hotel Arcadia was a particularly weird beast. Quartet, my publisher, had signed on. They were planning on editing, and they were sort of working with the manuscript. At the same time, my Dutch publisher decided they wanted to publish at the same time the Dutch translation. So they had a translator working alongside on the manuscript in a completely different country. And in some ways, I guess the editing function has changed, and there is, of course, this hesitance. I suppose there are two editors here; they can, maybe counter that or agree with it, on part of an editor in terms of, especially with literary fiction, kind of taking on the writer, who might get upset about even a comma or a full stop. So there's always this kind of back and forth that happens. My Dutch translator was not hindered by it, because she was rendering this manuscript into a completely different language, a language that's far more restrictive and far more austere in some ways than English is. She was bringing a completely different storytelling tradition, so she was trying to figure out all these elements, which then meant that she would look at the manuscript and find things that an English language editor would completely not even consider, or it was part of, somewhere it would fade into the background. So things like, if it's 4 hours later, exactly what time of the day is it? So we ended up doing these strange exercises with having to, go through the entire manuscript, the fine-tooth comb, because you'd say, wait, that was 3 p.m. It's now, is it 7 p.m.? Is it going to be dark? Is it not? And I don't know. I just wrote it. But she was very, very clear that this needed to be resolved. She was also very clear that there were other issues around language. Now, one of the things that was very, very interesting, and it still sticks out, she sent me quite late in the second or third sort of revising her own work. She said, what you're talking about this character as light, what does that mean? It makes no sense. And then, of course, I realized she was talking about lightness as weight and mass. I was talking about light as in dark and light. So there was this really strange process of then going, right. And she said, I can't find a way to say this in Dutch. It doesn't work. So that was quite fascinating, but there were lots of instances of me learning how complicated the choices of words could be for a translator. And the fact that I'd completely ignored it, because for me English seemed, it's the language I love working in, because I can sort of mold it and kick it around and do things with it. And yet I think the final product, the final editorial product that came up in English came very much out of the changes that the Dutch translator had insisted on, or demanded, or asked, or requested. I'm sure she'll find different, nicer words for it than I'll use. And then we ended up, so each time we would make the changes, and then we'd sort of send it back to Quartet and say, look, this is now the manuscript in place. The strange thing, I think, was that it probably got to the stage when they just ended up doing a proofread, because it had gone through so many edits and so many changes, and we'd sort of gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. And it's a process that I have to say, having spoken to a lot of writer friends, it's not very, very common, even if you're working only in the English language. So having a translator work in another country, in another language, actually helped the script, helped the novel quite significantly. And I think, hopefully, did a sort of a Raymond Chandler thing, where it took what was a decent novel and made it into something much better.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to move on now to Alex and Sam. Alex Pheby is an academic and novelist who teaches at the University of Greenwich. I'm not sure if you ever overlapped with Sunny, but I believe you were at one point a librarian at London Metropolitan. So.
It was UNL, yeah. It was
What's on that?
And Alex's editor, Sam Jordison, a journalist, publisher and writer, is co-director of the award-winning and courageous Gali Beggar Press. He writes for The Guardian and TLS, and he's the author of several works of non-fiction. The latest is called Literary London, and is co-wrote with Eloise Miller. So Alex's novel Playthings is the account of a psychotic breakdown, told from the point of view of the person having the breakdown. It's a very fragmented narrative. We share Daniel Schreiber's moments of lucidity, and then there's a break, and we don't know how much time has passed or what's happened in between, and increasingly we lose a sense of what is real and what is not. Now, Alex, I had to confess to you that I had no idea until I finished the book that Schreiber was in fact a real person, a German judge.
Yeah.
Well, you can tell us more about him. He was a German judge who documented his own earlier breakdown, and whose writings were used by Freud and other people. Yeah. So can you tell us how you came across Schreiber's writings and how you became interested in them?
Certainly, yeah. Schreiber is one of those. I mean, I don't know whether you've all, hands up, who's heard of Daniel Paul Schreiber? I only assume you haven't read enough of your Freud then. He's one of Freud's kind of canonical case studies. There's 3 or 4 of them that people always go back to, and Schreiber's is one of them. Depends how much you know about Freud, but Freud used Schreiber as his argument that paranoia, schizophrenia, is often a defense against homosexual feelings of desire. Right? So you can map Freud's very complicated path through the Oedipal trajectory against Schreiber. It's not good stuff. We know Freud's bad, right? So don't look at me like I'm a Freudian and just me trying to plug the Freudian view. I don't agree with Freud on Schreiber. I don't agree with Freud on many things. He's useful here and there, but Schreiber for me was always a figure that was on the kind of margins of the things that I knew about. My dad was a philosopher of the continental tradition. He's a Heideggerian, and any fascists in the audience? Heidegger wasn't a fascist, or Heidegger, as I'm obliged to pronounce it, because that's what my dad would always say. Heideggerians weren't necessarily fascists, but Schreiber was spoken about by a lot of continental philosophers. So people like Derrida and Lacan and other sociologists like Canetti and people like that would often speak of Schreiber. And he was always one of those figures that I knew I should know about. And it came to my attention that my dad didn't know about Schreber as well as he ought to either, because we were discussing, as you do, with your father, Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari over the dinner table. And whether one could truly take the schizoaffective psychology as revolutionary, right, as you all would do. After you've watched The Great British Bake Off, it's on to various forms of psychoanalytic practice. So we were discussing whether. So, Dad, do you really think that that Schreber is emblematic of the schizoaffective self, right? Which can be used as a kind of revolutionary attack on bourgeois sensibilities? And well, I've never read it, so I wouldn't know. He said. Right. Okay, so imagine that. That was when I was about 16, 15, 16, something like that. And this goes into my head and is lodged there. And then I lived my life as one does. And I was working at the University of North London as a librarian. And I was cataloguing books, and Memoirs of My Nervous Illness came onto my desk. And Memoirs of My Nervous Illness is Schreber's account of his illness. That's not the German title. The German title is The Great Thoughts of a Nerve Case. But the English translation gives it as Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. And it is a series of great thoughts, or even more accurately, those things which ought to be remembered, right, as told by a nerve case. Okay, and so we have this book. It's a very thick book, which for me as a cataloguer of books was very difficult for me to deal with, because it straddled various disciplines. It straddled philosophy, it straddled psychology, it straddled psychoanalysis, history, and it was a difficult thing to place. Generally, nowadays, we use Dawson's. Any librarians in the room? Right. Dawson, right, which is the book supplier that most libraries use, catalogues your books for you. Right. It takes the Library of Congress cataloguing entry, and it will print up labels and stick them on the side, and thereby put loads of cataloguing librarians out of their jobs. But this wasn't the case when I was working there. So you had to read the book, a little bit of it, to work out where the book should be catalogued. Right? So I started reading it and couldn't stop. Basically, I knew it was one of those things that I should have known about, and that reason, and this kind of spiteful attempt to best my father, and just the general the degree of interest that the book itself held, kept me reading long past that period in which I should have put the book onto the shelves with the sticker on the side. So instead of doing my cataloguing, as I was obliged to do, and meeting my quotas, I read Memoirs of My Nervous Illness for, I think it was 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. It's a thick book. And that's how I came to know more about Schreber. Schreber was one of those people that I should have known about already and bluffed, but instead did. You all should know about Schreber. You should read my book, which is down here, right? And then, once that's read, you should go back to Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. It's still in print. You can get the New York Review of Books edition. If you're very, very kind of picky, you can get the original Dawson English translation, which I think runs about 500 quid for a first edition. Or if you want the original German edition, you say I sent you a link to it that time. How much was it? It was several £1,000s.
Yeah.
Wasn't it? It's quite a lot.
Pretty tasty.
And if you're ever in Durham, there's a thing rather like this, but in Durham, run by Hearing Voices, a kind of organisation that is doing academic study into auditory hallucinations. They've got a first edition that they've borrowed. You can come have a look at it. But it's a really good book. It's the kind of book that once you pick up, you can't really put down. It's repetitive. It's difficult to understand. It's difficult to read. But it also gives a very important view into non-normative mental activity, right? Which
I
otherwise
think
one
we
wouldn't
should probably move on to your book.
No. My book is the mere.
So Schreber documented one of his earlier breakdowns. You've gone into a fictional account of his final breakdown.
Yeah.
So what for you is the heart and soul of that book?
Right.
What were you trying to achieve with it?
Okay, well, it's a tricky one, this. All right. if you were to choose someone to write about and think to yourself, okay, well, there's a lot of space here, Schreber would not be the person that you'd want to write about. Everybody has written about Schreber, which makes it even more ridiculous that you haven't heard of him. Everyone of the 20th century largely has written about Schreber, to the point in which almost everything that one would imagine could be said about him has been said. There is a field of study called Schreber studies, right, which one could go into. I won't go into that. But there's a lot of things in Schreber studies, for example, that I don't agree with, right? And one of the reasons that I wrote the book was to put right certain things that I thought people had got wrong about Schreber studies. Schreber studies as a discipline is very heavily Freudian, right, for one thing, and I think Freud was wrong about Schreber. It also does, in general, Schreber studies is a very masculine discipline, right? It doesn't figure women's role in the story of Schreber. It doesn't figure women's role in psychological issues at all. And then that's another thing that I wanted to address. And also, I don't think it addresses accurately trauma and people's general traumas. There are a couple of things I wanted to deal with. One was that is the absence of Schreber's mother in the readings of Schreber's life. Almost all of the readings on Schreber's illness, the etiological kind of excuses for why Schreber became ill, focus on his father, who was a famous child-rearing expert in Germany, right? He's in the book, certainly, but along with him, you will also see Schreber's mother, you'll see Schreber's sister, and you'll see Schreber's wife and daughter, figures that don't appear in Schreber studies generally, or very, very marginally. Schreber believed, amongst other things, that God was turning him into a woman. Now, if one were to be presented as a 21st century human being with that notion, here is subject X who believes they're being turned into a woman, right? It would seem unusual to me that you didn't then look at his relationship with his mother, right? One way or another, or his wife, or his daughter, his adopted daughter. Those things aren't figured, and my feeling was that was something that was missed and needed to be dealt with. Schreber and his wife went through a very traumatic series of miscarriages and stillbirths, right, throughout his life, none of which are dealt with certainly not dealt with in the Freudian material, and none of them are dealt with in the later psychoanalytic material either. Right now, it would seem to me that someone who was having full wishes about being made into a mother, right, might have problems in their life with the generation of children, right, and consequently, that is an issue that also should have been dealt with one way or another. So my key psychological, from my point as an author, my desire to treat this subject was based on those, right? One, because I think women in general are underfigured in culture, and as is trauma, and in areas in which we can address that issue, then we should address them, regardless of our gendered position in society. Right? Now, there are arguments that it's none of my business and I shouldn't be appropriating areas that aren't my business to appropriate, although no one ever brings it up. I'm kind of waiting for people to bring it up, but no one ever does. I kind of wish they would, but no one ever does. I wish at the events like this, when people, well, what right do you think you have as a man, as a white middle-class man in 21st century to even appropriate this kind of material and deal with it? And I don't know how to respond, so we'll see if anybody ever wants to bring that up. But those are the reasons why I did it. Right. Also worth bearing in mind at this point that I was brought up as a girl. Right? Yeah, we don't like that. Yeah.
So Sam.
Pardon?
Did you enjoy being brought up?
There's no enjoy about it. I was brought up by Marxists, Marxist radical feminists, who were of the opinion that all forms of masculine activity were pernicious, and consequently should be weeded out from children. And I agree with them. They are right. All forms of masculine activity in the world are pernicious and should be weeded out of everybody. And I'm not joking. I think the masculine trope is vile and aggressive and should be destroyed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Throw that rock into the pool. We'll see where that goes.
Yeah,
But
but
I'm
it
going
never
to move
goes
on to
anywhere. This is
Sam.
fine. I'm just,
Absolutely.
no, we'll move on to Sam in a minute. It never does go anywhere. This is what I'm always, I'm amazed. The politeness with which audiences
I
greet
don't
that.
know. I know some of this lot.
Well, that's what they do. But generally that doesn't get picked up on.
So, Sam, you had this manuscript land on your desk.
Mhm.
So what was your response and how did you approach publishing it?
Well, my initial response was, I think, the response a lot of readers have, especially once you get to the end, which is, oh my God, because it's an intense and emotionally, I want to say demanding, but overwhelming thing to read. And it takes you into a very dark and confused and in some ways frightening place. I don't want to overplay that because there are brilliant moments of light and comedy and all the other things you hope for in a great novel. And I really do think it is a great novel. But my initial reaction as an editor was kind of cowardice in a way, because I knew that this was something very special, but I didn't know if I would be able to publish it and do it justice as a publisher and be able to explain it to people and put it out there. And because there are extremely, as well as these magnificent ideas, there are difficult things in it. So it talks about anti-Semitism, for instance, and the way it deals with madness. There's no, well, madness possibly, nervous collapse. There's no escaping the kind of the horror of some aspects of that and how it affects other family members. So that's it's a difficult thing for people to read, and it's a difficult thing to be confronted with. I think it's necessary to be confronted with that kind of thing because it's true and it's real and it matters. But thinking about how to, I've come now and I've had this little spiel and how to explain that to a journalist in a few lines, for instance, if I'm saying I've got this book to review and it's going to destroy you. How to get that over. So I had a few seconds of hesitation. I mean, I don't want to overplay it, but there, I was kind of going to write the email. I was like, do I say no? And then I thought, no, of course not. Everything that Gallibegger Press, though, our whole purpose really is to publish books that are being missed and people aren't taking on, and that people aren't taking risk. Our whole ethos is taking risk. So of course we had to publish it. It was our duty to publish it, and it's a magnificent, magnificent book. And if I thought that, other people would, which is kind of our ethos. So after a few seconds of hesitation, I wrote to Alex, and great, everything was happy. And luckily, as it turned out to be relatively easy to explain to people. And we've spoken a lot about Schreiber, but actually, in a way, Alex has teased you about Schreiber, but not knowing about Schreiber in a way is an advantage when you first read the book, because it's, as one of the reviews said, it's a brilliant, superb novel to core. You don't need to know about Schreiber to understand it as a book. My advice would be to read it first, have the intense experience of essentially a sad and in many ways beautiful story about a man who wants to go home and can't understand why he can't get home and why home is no longer there for him, and he has no foundations in the world anymore. And that's entirely relatable to anyone at any time. You don't necessarily have to know that it's about Schreiber. Then find out about Schreiber, read it a second time, and realise all the other ideas that are in there and just how magnificent it is. And it's even better the second time you read it, or the third time it's better still. But so in terms of the editorial, though, I mean, it's, Alex is a very fine writer, and there wasn't that much to do, in all honesty. One of the key editorial things was the main, I think, well, it depends on the book, but one of the most important jobs an editor can do is to take away barriers between the reader and the work. And it's not a question of changing or diluting or anything like that. It's just making it as direct as possible. And there was one bit in the book that kind of took the reader out of this intense claustrophobic experience that Schreiber's going through. So I
If you want that bit, by the way, I can email it to you.
So Ellie, who's my co-director and also edits with me most of the time, we both thought that should probably be taken out. And there were a few political things we were very nervous about getting the anti-Semitism, the material about anti-Semitism absolutely right, because we don't want to have that going over, anyone mistaking that in any kind of way. So we were extremely nervous about that. Probably more nervous than we needed to be, but that's
no one really mentioned it, did they?
No, of course not, because
Well,
hopefully we got it absolutely right. Yeah, but one of the things as an editor as well, and as a responsible publisher, you want to protect your author from anyone misinterpreting or misrepresenting their work.
I'm the other way. I don't mind people misinterpreting.
Well, misinterpreting, well, yeah. But
providing, my feeling is that I get to say all sorts of things that are controversial, providing I also am willing to sit here and answer for them.
Yeah, let's say taking it the wrong way.
Yeah, you're right.
That's the important thing. Everyone's going to in fact, I don't think you can misinterpret a novel because everyone has their own unique relationship with a novel. But taking it the wrong way and running away with that and causing all kinds of unnecessary problems for not just for Alex, but for people who think that there is something hurtful in the world, which again we don't want to be doing unnecessarily. Certainly not in that way.
There's so much more I want to talk about, but I want to move on to Dan and Rohan because I think we have a unique opportunity here because these two are in the process of working together on a manuscript. So we have a chance to actually get inside that process and see how it's working. So I'll just quickly introduce them for those of you who don't know them. Rohan Quine is a writer of literary fiction, she describes as with a touch of magical realism and the dusting of horror, celebrating the beauty, darkness and mirth of this predicament called life, where we seem to have been dropped without sufficient consultation ahead of time. Rohan's editor, Dan Holloway, is, if you're in the indie author world, you know him. He's a phenomenon. He's the grit in the oyster that provokes us all to create He's a poet, novelist, journalist, editor and performer. If you've never seen Dan behind a microphone, you haven't lived. Rabble-rouser-in-chief of the New Libertines, who've been touring UK's festivals and fringes since 2011, and he also runs the editing and copywriting business Rogue Interrobang. So Rohan's latest novel is Beasts of Electra Drive, is the story of a games designer who becomes deeply disenchanted with the lowest common denominator mentality of the big corporation he works for. And he leaves it in order to create a game of his own. But when his former employers refuse to take his desertion lying down, something rather strange happens, and characters from Jamie's games start to cross over into meat space and become the arms of Jamie's revenge. So, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Alex. What, for you, is the heart and soul of that novel?
As with the other titles, I suppose at the very centre of things is the desire to use every second of this very short life that we have to write something, to do something, in this case write, but for all of us to do something amazing, something that will challenge, not just get by, not just slip by. And so I want to interrogate, and if this brings my numerical audience down, if it brings the numbers down, that's fine. But to interrogate and to love and to slap around the face and to celebrate life for being so nasty and unfair in so many ways to certain people, causing certain people to fall into chasms of pain and horror, elevating others into magical highlands of sunlight, and a lot of other people in between. It's also random. It's kind of a love bite to the world. So the very heart, it's a slap around the face, but it's also a making love with the world. So the very, very heart of the impetus that is behind ultimately every syllable is that. Now, obviously, that has to be processed, that has to be tamed, it has to be turned into something that people actually want to read, and that involves incursions of technical, structural stuff like plot and so forth, and Dan's comments have been very, well, of course, Dan's comments have been very helpful in this regard. We're really only about a third of the way through the process, aren't we? But I think so, yes, at least. I mean, at most.
I hope we are at most.
At most, indeed,
yes.
so, yes. By the way, the stage we've got to is that I think within the last week, in fact last night for the first time I read his comments of the entire first draft of the manuscript. So that's the stage we're at. It was a very carefully written first draft. It was created over the course of 2 years. So although I'm sure it needs a lot of improvement, nonetheless it was, if you like, perhaps a more decent first draft than some first drafts. So I tend to write slowly and carefully, very slowly and very carefully, and then revise only once or twice, and that's it. It might be more efficient to write
more times this time.
more times than that. Yeah, right. There you go. So that's the stage we're at. But that's, coming back to your question, that's the non-negotiable. It's a flame and a dark pit of horror, and how they can meet and then get translated to everybody on the horizontal axis.
But Dan, when you first read the manuscript, what was your response, and what were the things that you felt were central
the phrase
to it?
that comes out it's what Rohan says there. There's this phrase, dusting of horror. I mean, that's everything about it, because it's... And it transpired that I actually had to label up some of these phrases in the book, because he didn't realise he has this amazing voice that is at once completely hilarious and yet utterly terrifying. I described it when I was talking to him as Alex from A Clockwork Orange as played by Dick Van Dyke, which is just this glorious image that came into my head when I was reading the character of Jamie. There's something I absolutely adore more than anything else culturally, the purest form of kitsch that takes itself the sort of kitsch that takes itself 100% seriously. I would say someone like Klimt, or even
The painter Gustav Klimt.
Yeah,
okay.
as opposed to
I didn't know. I was just
Klimt
checking.
who makes sandwiches
Yes,
down
exactly.
at Borough Market. and also, I absolutely adore Koontz, and I know that's very unpopular. But I love this glossy, shiny, camp, fabulous gloriousness that's also got teeth that will sink themselves into you, because you just want to look closer and you want to look over the edge at this beauty. But then as soon as you see the beauty close up, you see that it's made of these terrifying parts. And that's the quality in the writing and in the vision that he has of what life should be, this beautiful spectacle compiled of horror.
Now, Beasts makes a lot of use of repetition at a structural level, and I think that repetition is something we accept in music, we accept in writing for children, but in writing for adults, it's something that we normally think we need to get rid of. There's something wrong if you're having a lot of repetition. So I guess there's a question for both. For Rohan, why are you using that repetition? And Dan, what was your response to that?
Shall I?
Yeah, you first.
Yeah, it's actually only certain phrases that occur each time a beast is created. There are a total of 7 beasts, and there's a main sequence of about 4 or 5 beasts in the middle. And Jamie, my protagonist, goes through a similar, not exactly the same, but a similar sequence each time he creates another beast, which is a person, by the way. These are not animals. They're sort of like replicants, as you'd see in Blade Runner, but it's not sci-fi, but just so you know, they look like people. And he creates them. He creates them, first of all, as fictional characters, and then they go out to the real world. Every time he does that, there's sort of a sequence where he creates their code. He then gives them a soundtrack. I'm bringing in ideas from movies here, obviously. Soundtrack. He gives them an appearance. They don't start out with an appearance. As a creator, he clothes them in a skin or appearance. And then, he test drives them, and then he sends them out, etc. There's a whole sequence. So it made sense to unify the sequence of individual components of the novel, partly through means of these repeated phrases at exact planned out junctures during each of those sequences. Secondly, there's power and magic in incantatory repetition. We see it in music, certainly in pop music, I'm sure in classical music as well, about which I know much less, but I'm sure we see it in all kinds of music. You can lose yourself in music partly because of the incantatory repetition that's going on. The incantation itself, including its use of repetition, speaks to a kind of direct cell-level thing that's going on, doesn't it? That rhythm, that thing that, is something you can benefit from in terms of if you're wanting to harness the power that's available to you in a story with language. Language is audible. It's the Irish know this, don't they? You tell a story and it's audible. There's an oral thing going on, and very many tales and fairy tales and children's tales use it. As a random example, there's one of the Jusso stories by Kipling. Then came Dingo, yellow dog Dingo, etc., cutting through the salt pans, etc., across, and he keeps on repeating it. It's prose, but there's this incantatory thing, and you sit there and you're like this because of the repetition. That's basically it.
Yeah, no, I had three sort of distinct responses to it. We had some interesting conversations around it when I was asking him what, because I asked him, I didn't want to say what I thought I wanted to. We had a long conversation. I asked him why he'd done it, and he said some of that and the rest of that he's taken from my comments and presented them as his, which is exactly how it should be in the relationship between an author and an editor. My first obvious thought was of liturgy and of the days of creation, and the way that in Genesis each day of creation ends with the same incantation. And so we've literally got, it makes perfect sense for a creation cycle to have this pattern to it. The second thing it brings to mind is that repetition we hear most in oral storytelling because it was always used as a marker. And Ginsberg does it in Howl with the who, and we get it in a lot of myths because it's, if you lose your place, it's you go back to this and then you can start again. And so it gives it a mythic quality. And so these are both reasons that I want that aspect worked up. And the other thing it reminded me of was the passage that those of you who know Bolaño, 2666, the part about the crimes. I'm not going to say it because it's a bit grim, but there's a very famous use of repetition in the part about the crimes, which is used to dehumanize in order to rehumanize, and it has this effect of turning something utterly horrific into mere words, and as it becomes mere words, so you get the possibility of then transcending those words by injecting content into them. So I love the use of repetition for that sort of almost a modernist purpose, that you are able to take the meaning out of the words and then inject your own meaning back into them.
Keep moving. So I think all three novels have slightly unusual structural elements to them. Hotel Arcadia not only has that sort of countdown towards the climax, using the hours in the headings, mixed in with flashbacks and things, but it also, the whole physical structure of the hotel is again based on Dante and the 9 Circles of Hell, isn't it? So can you say something more about that?
I guess it goes back to that love story. It then made sense to, as it developed, it made sense to have this structure. I have to say, back in the 90s, I worked a lot with the mining industry. I know that sounds a really weird thing to say. In Latin America and in Southern Africa. And as part of that, I spent quite a lot of time staying and living in hotels, and I absolutely grew to hate them. And I still go into hotels and I just panic because there is something quite hellish about them, and the kind of, we were talking about repetition. I mean, there is this repetitive quality to the architecture, the aesthetics, the design, the decor, and somehow it worked very well with this idea of Dante's very, very clearly worked out architecture of Inferno, and there were other symbolic uses as well. One of the characters is the hotel manager, and he's got multiple issues around it, but in many ways he's the moral center of Hotel Arcadia. But everything he does, regardless of how well intentioned, is in some way a betrayal of what he loves. And if you know Dante's Inferno, at the bottom in sort of hands of Lucifer, mouth of Lucifer, are the three great betrayers, starting with Judas. And yet Judas, the Gnostics will argue, is the greatest of all disciples and the greatest of all apostles and saints, because he sacrifices himself for Christ and for Christ's glory. So there was a whole series of theological ideas that I wanted to play with, and that kind of came through quite easily in that architecture. There was a flip side to this planning out the architecture of this hotel was, and that was the structure of the novel itself and the countdown. I'm a massive Scorsese fan, and I'm a huge Goodfellas fan. So if you actually read the novel, you'll start picking up as to the ways in which the chapters and the times are structured. There is this kind of countdown, and there's this speeding up of the action as it goes towards the end. And yes, I know it sounds really weird. So there's Dante and Scorsese. It's my two literary gurus for the novel.
And Alex, your novel, as I've already said, it's a very fragmented narrative, because it's reflecting how aware Schreiber is of his surroundings. So that's
well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's pretty straight, to be honest. I think it follows a straight timeline. He is at home, he enters the asylum, and he dies.
Spoilers!
We run it along. Like, you can look this up yourself. You don't have to. It's based on a true story, folks. So I mean, I think that there are. I mean, the way in which it's told does involve a lot of memory. But I think our existence in general does. So I wouldn't say it was non-naturalistically structured.
No, not naturalistic. But there is that you do use those time jumps to disorient the reader.
Definitely.
Don't you?
Yeah. There's a lack of announcement between the parts that are kind of in the general run of his experience and those parts that he is remembering, and the parts that he remembers are often more worked up than his normal life, for example. So he'll begin a kind of memory of the past of an event, and that will certainly take over and act more as a kind of narrative present than the narrative present does.
And Schreiber is unaware of how much time is passing, and the reader loses track of time with Schreiber.
Yeah.
So even though the narrative does go in a fairly straight line, it's very
That's true.
confusing
There are
for the
months
readers.
and years that pass as if nothing's happened, certainly. And I think that's one of the disjointed effects that you can work with, is this assumption that we all bring to chaptering, that chapter 2 is going to follow on from chapter 1, and chapter 3 will follow on from chapter 2, and they will be roughly chronologically distinct, or it will be announced if they aren't. So you will expect many years later to precede material that is many years later. Whereas if it's not there, and it seems to act as if it is, then certainly that's something you can do. But I mean, I think I tried to make it readable as a story, right? As something that one would read as a narrative. And it is readable in that way. The effects of disjunction are there, certainly, to make one feel ill, right, in places. And I think this is the way you tend to use them, is that there'll be a sickening jolt when you realise, oh, hold on, he thinks Christmas is on the horizon, but Christmas has long passed, and he never did the things that he'd promised to do at Christmas. And it'll be there'll be a lurch at that point. But in terms of the structuring of the novel and the structuring of the narrative, it's perfectly possible to read it as Schreiber, and to take that as an ABC rather than an A, B, C, which is how it actually plays out.
Another thing all these books have in common is that they're intensely visual. And one of Sunny's main characters is a photographer. We see a lot of things through her eyes in terms of plays of light and dark. And Schreiber can become intensely focused, all his senses, on one tiny element in a room to the exclusion of all else. reading your book reminded me of looking at one of those sort of hyper realistic paintings, but that had a surreal twist in it. So I guess it's a question for all three authors. I'm looking at the time. I'm afraid it might have to be the last question. I've got so much more I'd like to talk about. How important is that visual element to you, and how do you bring that into your writing? Should we start with Sunny again?
Okay. Gosh. Well, I study film. I'm a film scholar. I used to work for a while as a film producer. I love photography, and we all live in the camera generation, the phone camera generation. So, I mean, really, it's kind of part and parcel of how we go about it. But I'm actually going back to something that I remember reading as a teenager, and it was this amazing moment. There's a point very early on in Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, where the character stands outside. He's followed these two adults who seem to be in this illicit relationship, and he stands outside the cafe, and as he looks, the prose does this wonderful thing where it switches. There is no physical possibility of somebody standing outside the cafe to zoom in, but the child's eye becomes this camera, this movie camera that zooms in closer and closer to the couple inside, and then finally just focuses on the cigarette packet in two hands on the table that are kind of playing around it. And I remember reading that as a teenager and just going, this is it. This is a way that brings together all the different ways we see the world. And it was also that moment I just remember realizing that the way we see is trained. There is no such thing as a natural, normal way of looking at anything, looking at reality. And so for me, that's probably what plays a part with all my books, but very much so with Hotel Arcadia. There are ways of seeing, and hopefully that makes you question what we see, the veracity of it, the impact of it. And I think all the things that the photographer Sam does and does not do should hopefully question that. I think, there are issues around this idea that somehow an image is true. And I wanted to flag that up, that actually most of the time it isn't.
Rohan, same question
yes,
to you?
absolutely central and totally fizzing on the surface as well, this visual stuff, and very much screens as well. That clearly has changed since the screens came along in the 20th century. It's clearly changed so much. So there's a lot of zooming in a way that couldn't actually happen, across a valley to see a tiny reflection on someone's pupil and that sort of thing. And again, I haven't read that book, shame on me, but just Rushdie's book. But nonetheless, yes, I absolutely you can imagine how exciting that sort of thing can be. And so there's a huge amount of playing, not at random, but playing in a serious way with framing and point of view and so forth. And there's a lot of scope for that in creating other creatures and then having them see things. And then, this particular setup was set up in order partly to explore the visual aspect of people and representations of them and what they all mean and so forth. Yes.
And finally, Alex?
Yeah, I think it's fun as a writer. It's one of the fun things to work out interesting and new ways of describing things. I think also one tends to be judged on the veracity of one's similes. That's one of the things that reviewers like to pick up. If you've got a good line that describes something that people have heard about 1,000 times, it's nice to be able to do that. But I think generally what I tend to did in this book, not in all books, but with Schreiber, it's a kind of a trick. It's like a magician's thing or a pickpocket's thing. It's like, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, and taking the pick, it's like, oh, I've got your wallet. It's the extent to which Schreiber would often focus on something very, very particular allows you to do those kind of tricks where you do a chronological jump, because then you cut back and a month has passed, right? And it's not a minute has passed, that time in which one was focusing on this or remembering this. It is a much longer period. And even just that is sufficient to give you a sense that your psychological progression through the world has been altered. So particularly in Schreiber, I mean, it's fun in general, but it plays a structural trick in this book, you know, to divert your attention from something you're about to do.
Oh, as I say, there is so much more I would like to talk about, but I think, looking at the time, we're going to have to call a halt, I'm afraid. So thank you very much to all of our guests. So
And thank you.